Okay, so then I'm going to share my screen and just make this like that and go into presentation piece. Can everybody see that okay? Can you see that, Hannah?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Brilliant. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming along. Today's presentation title is Grief Still Shattered but Still Standing. And I chose this image of balancing rocks for this first slide because sometimes grief can feel like so many very heavy rocks that need to be carefully balanced every single day. And sometimes even balanced from moment to moment. Sometimes all the rocks fall down and we have to start all over again, and it can feel overwhelming. So, as a reminder, this presentation piece is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Cancer Care website afterwards, so that you can revisit any part of this presentation later on if you want to. And after the presentation finishes, the recording will then be stopped. And when we're going through any questions and answers or discussions, that part will not be recorded. Some basic rules for today to remember is to respect that everybody is bringing their own experience to today. When you're listening, try to avoid interrupting someone if they're speaking. And don't share someone else's story after this event. It's theirs to tell, just like yours is yours to tell. And we also ask that we avoid trying to fix, advise, or rescue anyone else today. This has been recorded, so if you can keep your microphones on mute, that would be great. And then the recording will be stopped. And then if you could then turn on your cameras, that would be great so that we can see each other. And during the discussion piece, it's okay to speak or not to speak. It's okay to ask questions or not ask questions. Just see how you feel and see what would be useful for you today. Next month, there's a different topic for grief talks, and it will be, do different people grieve differently? So each month on the second Tuesday of the month between 10 and 11 in the morning, there'll be different topics related to grief. If you need one-to-one support or have any questions after today's event, don't hesitate to contact us at Cancer Care West. If you would like to attend next month's event, just register on the website like you did for today. Really simple. And then we'll finish up at around 11 this morning. So this photo was very kindly shared with me by a client who has been bereaved by cancer. A glass door in her home spontaneously shattered as she sat nearby. And this image speaks to the experience of grief and grieving for many people after someone they love dies. It's like looking through shattered glass into the world. Nothing is the same and everything feels broken somehow for you, and everyone else gets to carry on like before. Grief impacts us on all levels. Nothing is untouched when someone we love dies. For people, these impacts can include physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels. The physical impacts can include changes to your appetite. You can either lose your appetite or increase your appetite. You can have changes to your weight. You can have physical aches and pains all over. And your sleep may even be disrupted or quite changed. Your immune system and response can be very different and can be very challenged. And your energy can feel very low with the heaviness of grief. You may even feel very clumsy and walk into things. Dehydration can even be an issue if you're crying a lot and not drinking as much water as usual. You can have concentration issues with memory loss and brain fog, even grief brain, I've heard people call it. And there's even a medical diagnosis of broken heart syndrome that some people experience in the aftermath of grief, a heart arrhythmia. So grief can be very physical, and some of the mental impacts that can come along with grief. Again, that loss of ability to concentrate, because of course, those physical impacts affect us mentally also. There can be a reduced memory or forgetfulness. And it can feel really difficult to do ordinary mundane tasks, the energy involved and the concentration. Ordinary problems can feel extra hard to sort out and solve. You may even have frequent intrusive thoughts that can be distressing at times. And you can be continually thinking about the person who's died at times. Denial can also happen. And you may have thoughts around helplessness, hopelessness, and vulnerability. If the worst has happened, what if other awful things can happen too? And how do I ever feel safe in this world again? The emotional impacts of grief can include a roller coaster of emotions and feelings. This can include sadness, anguish, loneliness, guilt, anger, fear, anxiety, rage, and even feeling lost. Your moods can swing suddenly and feel really intense. You can feel really alone in your experience of grief and quite isolated. There can be a sense of feeling overwhelmed all the time by everything whenever grief really hits. And that helplessness and hopelessness about the future. You can have a changed sense of yourself and feelings of, who am I now that this has happened? I'm forever changed by this experience. Some of the spiritual impacts can include changes in your religious or spiritual beliefs about why things happen, what happens after we die, your relationship to God, or your religious beliefs. Maybe you start going to Mass again, or church, or synagogue, or maybe you stop altogether. Prayer might be a comfort, or prayer might not help anymore. You might actually feel quite angry towards God. You can have changes in your beliefs and assumptions around why things happen. This next slide is all about how throughout history, as human beings, we've tried to make sense of this experience of grief. We live and we love and we're mortal. So love is wrapped up in the grief that follows the death of someone we love. These beautiful sculptures all express different aspects of grief and grieving. The tears and sadness, the emptiness and absence, the heaviness and loneliness, the physical pain of grief, and the different ways that people might grieve over the loss of the same person because their relationship to them was unique. The Japanese artist Motoi Yamamoto has spent many years creatively expressing his grief. His wife and his sister both died from cancer a few years apart, and he chose salt and labyrinths to express his grief for them both over time. Each labyrinth looks like a shattered landscape. He chose salt because it's what is in our tears as we cry, and labyrinths because they are very confusing, but there's always a way through if we keep moving. And the labyrinths themselves are all temporary and brushed away at the end of each exhibition. So each one is temporary because grief is always changing and never stays the same. And I felt this was a beautiful expression of his grief. He said, "This smooth, gentle colour enveloped my heart in an embrace as it was racked with feelings of loss." There are many artists expressing their grief creatively throughout history, through sculpture, paintings, music, songs, poetry, dancing, and crafting. If you could even think for a moment, what activity brings you comfort and helps you make a small bit of meaning while you're grieving? Is it walking, swimming, journaling, gardening, baking, listening or making music, art or craft making? If any activity brings a moment of comfort for you, then that's an important activity to incorporate into your life when you can. This next slide asks, what's normal in grief? And I would like you to look at all of these words, and they all describe what's normal in grief. What stands out to you in your experience of grief? Have you noticed any changes in your grief over time? Do certain feelings or behaviours emerge and then go away, replaced by something else? Or is there anything on this page that does not fit with your experience of grief? Have you been judging yourself or other people because of ideas around what is and what is not normal in grief? And is judgment a helpful thing with grief? This next slide is all about Megan Devine's rules when grief hit hard. So the first principle is safety first. If grief's hitting you really hard, you have to look after yourself. If you're driving and you're crying, you need to pull over. If you're about to get in the car, you need to make sure you're calm before you're driving. Look both ways when you cross the road and go up and down stairs carefully. Tend something, water plants, brush the floor, cuddle an animal, send a letter, bake a cake, do something caring for a little while for someone or something else, and that can sometimes help. Being outside in nature can feel like a relief with grief. The trees won't ask you, how are you really? And the wind doesn't really care if you cry or how you cry. And there's a lot to be said about being in places that don't need anything from you. Find a place in nature and let the earth hold you up for a little while. Drink water. Crying for months on end is really dehydrating. Please keep drinking water. Your body needs it. And showering can help you feel just a little bit better for a moment. The same goes even for sweeping the floor or any other tedious or irrelevant task inside or outside the house. Focusing on something else just for a moment might help you feel a little bit better for a moment. Movement can be helpful. In whatever way your body can move, move it. Do yoga, go for a run or a hike or a short walk or even a dance. Even a 10-minute walk is a good place to begin. Not because it solves anything, but because movement is good and can help soothe your mind and body just for a little bit. Saying no and saying yes, you can't afford any big drains on your energy when grief is hitting you hard. And you can't afford to miss too many ways to refill your energy. This will mean saying no to some people and places and events that are too much for you. It'll also mean leaving a place you thought you could be, right in the middle of everything. Say no to what drains you and say yes to what might offer you even a tiny bit of goodness in the moment. Some people eat under stress and some people lose all interest in food. Some people develop serious, long-lasting physical challenges due to what some people call the grief diet. Small bites of healthy, nutritious foods might be easier for your mind and body than big, full meals. Do what you can to support your body as you grieve. And then this next slide, David Counsellor has written an awful lot about grief, and there are 6 elements that he talks about that I think is very useful. First one is support. A community can be 1 or 2 trusted people that you can rely upon, or your neighbours, people you see out and about, or a hobby group, or your friends. We're not built to be alone in hard times, and grief is hard times. Connection. It's really okay to continue to connect with the person you love that has died. If talking to them helps, that's okay. Including them in conversations is okay. Be creative with how you find ways to connect with the person you love. With identity, remember that going through grief does not define who you are. Yes, you're a different person because this has happened, and there is no going back to who you were before. But you're more than your grief, even if it doesn't feel like that sometimes. With care, ask yourself, how would you look after a cherished friend who is hurting? Can you offer a little bit of that care to yourself, that gentleness and understanding? Sometimes we're hardest on ourselves, and practicing being a good friend to yourself can be helpful in grief. With gentleness, comparing yourself to anyone else is a pointless and hurtful activity. No one else is going to grieve exactly like you. Your loss is unique, and there are no timelines. It's not a competition to complete quickly. And being gentle with yourself as you grieve is really important. And last of all, hope. Can you notice all the small ways you've gotten through each day and each hour? Did you get dressed today? Well, that's a win. You made it along to this event, or you're watching this recording online. That's also a win. Hope is really important, and noticing the small ways that you are coping matters. And there's a paradox at the centre of grief, and it lies in the fact that it's both unique and universal. You had a relationship with the person who died that no one else had. Your grief and grieving is unique to you. And as well as that, every single person alive faces grief sooner or later. It's woven into everyone's life at some point. Grief and love connect us all as human beings. Mary Frances O'Connor captures it well when she says, there's a difference between a description of grief versus a prescription for how to grieve. For each of us, our grief is as unique as our relationship. Stay curious as to you discover what your grief needs are and what it looks like over time. There's no box labeled grief that you have to fit your grief into. It's unique to you and your life. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is quite often associated with the stages of grief. In reality, she interviewed people who were dying at a time when no one wanted to talk about death. She discovered some themes that she heard people talking about, and then our culture then created a sort of a tick box list of grief and grieving tasks. But grief isn't tidy and it's never really finished. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Counsellor speak about grief when they say, the reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You'll learn to live with it. You will heal and rebuild yourself around the loss that you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to. And this quote is far closer to the reality of grief. We can be shattered, but still standing. And I'm going to finish today's presentation with this little image that shows how grief isn't a task that can be forever done or a stage that's tidy. The person on the left here is connected to the person that they loved who died and is saying, I think I will miss you for the rest of my life. And it's okay to carry your grief with you as you continue to be alive in this life. Your love and connection to the person who died can continue on. That's what grief and grieving is all about. You finding your way to do your grief and grieving, to care for yourself or to ask for care when you feel shattered, but keeping sight of how you're still standing and refinding balance in each moment. So I thank you for your attention today. And now we'll have a chance for questions and answers and maybe a discussion. But if you just hold on a moment until I stop sharing and stop the recording, we can move on to that piece. Okay, just going to stop the recording.